Right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sophie Peter, who's a guest from the Social Ecological Research Institute in Frankfurt, Germany. So Sophie's not been involved formally in landscape decisions, but what she does is very well aligned with what a lot of us have been doing in the program. She works in the Biodiversity and People Research Unit with a focus on socio-cultural dynamics of ecosystem services. I hope I got that right, Sophie. And her presentation this morning is entitled Landscape Management for Multifunctionality and Social Equity. So welcome, Sophie, and the floor is yours. That should appear.
Yeah.
Pretty, you don't have to do anything. You can use that if you want
for
moving, or you could just use the up and downs.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, good morning and welcome to my presentation about how to identify land use targets that promote high and equitable nature's contribution to people or ecosystem services. And also, as already said, I'm Sophie Peter. I'm a social scientist from Germany and working on ecosystem services from a social perspective. So, yeah, I took this picture in Hainisch-Dün, that's a region in Germany, during my fieldwork for my PhD. And in this photo, we witness a landscape offering a wide range of ecosystem services or nature contribution to people within a limited space. Relevant ecosystem services are, for example, hunting, livestock and food production, but also the production of timber and wind energy, and also cultural services like leisure or the creation of regional identity because of this specific landscape. The landscape is shaped by the varied demands of ecosystem services of different stakeholder groups. So, for example, farmers prioritize livestock and food production, while a citizen is maybe more interested in leisure activities in nature. So this diversity can lead to trade-offs and an overconsumption of natural resources, as the ecosystems must simultaneously provide various services at a high level. So globally, multiple suggestions exist for large-scale land use changes to tackle these social and environmental issues. One prominent example maybe is the United Nations 30 by 30 target. And adopted in Montreal last year, this initiative aims to conserve 30% of the Earth's lands and ocean resources by 2030. You can see on the left corner. Many countries have implemented an agri-environmental scheme similar to England's, and these programs encourage sustainable farming practices and protect natural habitats. Another ambitious proposal gaining traction is to protect half of the Earth's surface. This would entail safeguarding a substantial proportion of land and oceans to preserve biodiversity. So these global initiatives reflect our growing commitment to addressing social and environmental challenges on a large scale. So scientifically, diverse approaches exist for modeling potential development scenarios that illuminate future pathways. For example, participatory scenarios development who engages stakeholders, and this method integrates real trade-offs and fosters the creation of shared visions. Yet there's a daring challenge, so the quantification of these inherently qualitative scenarios. On the other side, biophysical models exist to calculate the effects of land use on ecosystem services and are used for quantitative analysis. These models face the opposite challenge, so while they are quantitative and therefore statistically meaningful, they lack the connection on the impact on stakeholders. So, working as an interdisciplinary team of natural and social scientists, we aim to fill this gap between these different approaches. So our goal is to identify landscapes that maximize the supply of ecosystem services to stakeholder groups, while being socially equitable. Our approach to assessing ecosystem services multifunctionality involves two key components: the supply of services and the stakeholder prioritization. By combining these elements, we can calculate a multifunctionality score for different stakeholder groups. So the score ranges from 0 to 1 for each groups, where 1 indicated that all ecosystem services are provided at the desired level for the stakeholder group. As a result, we can easily compare the multifunctionality score of different groups, which is a key point if the goal is to achieve an equitable distribution. So to sum up, it's a robust methodology for evaluating the intricate relationship between ecosystems and human well-being. Empirically, our research is grounded in the extensive and long-term project known as the Biodiversity Exploratories, generally founded by the German Science Foundation. This remarkable project encompasses 3 diverse regions, each holding ecological and social significance. 2 of these regions, the Schorfheide-Chorin and the Hainisch Dün, are situated in former East Germany, where the fall of the Berlin Wall ushered in unique social and economic challenges. In contrast, the 3rd region, the Schwäbische Alb, is located in southern Germany and stands as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, pioneering sustainable regional development alongside also with the Schorfheide-Chorin. So while the Biodiversity Exploratories have primarily focused on collecting data related to ecosystem functions, our project represents a pioneering effort. We are among the first to integrate a social science perspective, delving into a social ecological system of each region. So one of my main contributions to the project as a social scientist was to obtain data on the prioritization of ecosystem services. In order to do this, I carried out several steps. So first, I conducted workshops in the 3 regions to better understand the social network and to identify relevant ecosystem services jointly with the stakeholders. Secondly, I conducted a quantitative survey in order to have stakeholders prioritize the identified ecosystem services. So as a first result of the quantitative survey, the stakeholder groups divided their ecosystem services priorities widely across the identified 12 ecosystem services, indicating a general tendency to the demand for ecosystem services multifunctionality, but also differences in the ecosystem services priorities of the stakeholder groups can be observed. So for example, agriculture prioritizes provisioning services more intensely, while tourism prioritizes more cultural services, which is not a surprise, but a surprise more that they really want a multifunctional landscape. So as a next step, these results were correlated with socio-cultural factors like the cultural worldviews of the different people, the perception of nature, and the stakeholder group and political affiliation. So as a second result, focusing on priority, we can elaborate distinct cultural types of ecosystem services priority. So, for example, we were able to identify a group that prefers mostly open land provisioning ecosystem services. These are mostly farmers, and they tend to have a more individualistic perspective on society, so mostly focusing on their own benefit. On the other side, we can show that people who prioritize environmental protection are affiliated to research and nature conservation and have rather an egalitarian worldview. The results show that ecosystem services prioritization is socially constructed and are indications not only of how nature is treated, but also of the willingness to minimize risks by changing demand or to question the prioritization of needs. So in sum, their identification provides a strong basis for understanding what shapes ecosystem services priorities. Within the project, we used this data for our final novel research step to link it to natural science data to better understand the multifunctionality of ecosystem services. So this leads then to the other factor in the calculation of multifunctionality, the supply side. Here, a distinction can be made between 3 land use types: grasslands, forests, and cropland. And in the exploratories, plot-level data are collected in grassland and forest, but unfortunately, we do not yet have data from cropland, so we rely on literature here in our simulations. In the scenarios shown later, the share of cropland is therefore remains the same. So a total of 11 ecosystem services and relevant indicators are integrated into the multifunctionality metric, a scope that has rarely been integrated in studies to date and which was identified by regional stakeholders. So the symbols next to the indicators indicate the land use types that provide each service. So if it's provided in forest, grasslands, croplands, or in a mixture of it. And the arrow width pointing to the multifunctionality in the middle are the proportional to the mean priority score given to the service across all stakeholder groups in the 3 regions. So this illustration is quite intricate, so I will focus on a few key aspects to explain. For instance, let's delve into the ecosystem service biodiversity protection on the right side. So on a landscape scale, we've utilized indicators such as plant gamma diversity and bird gamma diversity, and these indicators have been measured across various land types, including forests, grasslands, and cropland. So, informed by our data, we have undertaken simulations of diverse landscape compositions. Our starting point is the baseline, representing the current composition of grassland, forest, and cropland in the 3 regions. And leveraging the available data, we have crafted various scenarios at the landscape scale level, each designed to meet specific criteria related to multifunctionality and equitable distribution of the ecosystem services. To begin, let's delve deeper into the baseline scenario. So the left figure illustrates the current landscape compositions across the 3 regions. So we can observe that cropland occupies a substantial proportion, while forests also make a significant share. In the middle, you can see the multifunctionality score for various stakeholder groups. So surprisingly, even in the current baseline, this score is already really high for all groups. This indicates that all stakeholder groups demand landscape multifunctionality. And as already indicated at the beginning of my presentation, there are different ambitions to shape the social ecological system in a sustainable way. So in this scenario, we run through the effects of focusing on a single service, here carbon sequestration. And as a result, the landscape changes and the proportion of forest cover increases dramatically. Other services are reduced in their offer, and thus the multifunctionality is reduced for most groups. So this leads maybe to conflicts and can be also explained in this way. Another goal could be to maximize biodiversity and prioritize it above all other services. And the scenario optimal biodiversity shows that the supply of a wide range of ecosystem services are negatively affected when you're only focusing on this one service. And the multifunctionality of all stakeholder groups decreases. It can therefore be stated that only focusing on increasing the supply of one ecosystem service may negatively affect the whole social ecological system. So therefore, the question is how to balance the needs of different stakeholder groups. So we have focused on two objectives here: maximizing the multifunctionality, which is presented on the x-axis, and the equal distribution of services on the y-axis. Distribution equity is in our study defined as the appropriate and fair distribution of goods and resources, also known as outcome justice, which was defined by the authors Wallet et al. In a publication in 2019. So our goal is to identify scenarios situated in the upper right green quadrant, indicating both high equity and multifunctionality for all stakeholder groups, and therefore higher than the baseline. So the figure shows the variety of landscape composition that were run through the simulation. A dot represents a landscape composition. And as a result, it can be said that the baseline is already close to the optimum, as the multifunctionality score already indicated. So what would be an even more optimal scenario look like? In the scenario, optimal multifunctionality and equity shows an increase of forest and grassland de-intensification, and because of that, there's a loss of livestock production, but a gain in most other services. So as a result, the multifunctionality increases for all groups equitably. So in summary, and as discussion points regarding our approach to calculate ecosystem services multifunctionality, the following key points should be noted. The approach shows the high potential of mixed methods approaches, combining natural and social science data, and the landscape simulation approach. The multifunctionality approach is a way of capturing first ecosystem benefits, and second, incorporating multiple values. It gives the possibility to look at the social impact of biodiversity and land use change, so it offers more insights than the usually used economic approach. As a social scientist, I have particularly drawn two key learnings from this process. So first, the integration of societal information has great potential to firstly better understand impacts of different landscape types on the societal system, and secondly, to identify and communicate possible conflicting goals. So, and with our methodology, we were able to consider 14 interest groups or stakeholder groups in an equal way. With that, we knew from the beginning which groups are regionally present, and that was very important for me, not only to focus on specific groups like agriculture or forestry, but integrating a diverse picture of the social system. The baseline scenario demonstrates that it is already close to an optimum state, and this can be attributed to the social context in Germany, as the German landscape has been shaped by human interventions for millennia, forming an greatly interconnected system. So extreme interventions, as depicted in the scenarios, typically have a detrimental impact on multifunctionality for stakeholder groups, potentially giving a rise to conflicts. And the scenarios show that moderate de-intensification increases multifunctionality and equity. However, the externalization of demand and its impacts are not yet considered in our simulations. So we know we all eat meat from outside or eat an avocado from somewhere else. So to conclude, the perception that the nature-society relationship is disturbed does not necessarily lead to a dystopian interpretation. On the contrary, it reveals new opportunities for action to enable and nurture sustainable life in a globalized world. At the outset, I briefly outlined various approaches, all with the shared objective of separating nature from humanity in order to protect it from our overuse. So this is an extreme step that, while feasible, raises questions about the cost and effectiveness. Is it really the silver bullet solution? This is the question. To me, it sounds more like a simple solution to a complex problem. And the results show that there is no one-way solution, but a path that is complex, nonlinear, and requires continuous communication between individuals and subsystems, reflectivity and reflection. Our studies demonstrate the necessity of capturing the diverse demands of different groups, advocating for an integrative approach to gain a comprehensive understanding of what future scenarios might entail. It's essential to discard stereotypes, as our data reveals that even farmers prioritize aesthetic landscapes, or tourism views food production as an integral part of the landscape. An integrated interdisciplinary approach is crucial for incorporating these perspectives and linking them with ecological data. And this forms the foundation for negotiation processes regarding how we shape our future landscape. Thank you very much. So I think now it's time for questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a lot of time for questions, I think. So, who wants to start? John, I saw your hand go up first. The microphone is just behind you, John.
Hello, is that it? John Boardman, Oxford. A very simple question. Thanks for a great presentation. Did I understand that your results are all based on 3 study areas? In which case, how typical are they of the German landscape?
So I think they're typical for the German landscape on an ecological perspective, but also a social perspective. So the Biodiversity Exploratories were established to represent a topography gradient of Europe. So the Schafheide Korin is more representing the north landscape of Europe. Then the Hainisch Dün is more representing like the middle part of Europe. And then the Schwäbische Alb is representing more like the mountainous system in Europe. So from an ecological perspective, that was the gradient why these regions were selected in 2006. And from a social side, this is new now because it was more like focusing on natural science or data collection in the beginning, but it also represents the rural areas in Germany quite well. And you have, because of this distribution to the east and to the west of Germany, you have these different social challenges who happened because of our history. So this is quite interesting, but for sure they are protected areas, so they're not really representing like the real rural landscape in Germany from a social perspective, because they already have implemented sustainable programs like what is done by the UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, for example. So this have to be in mind when we are talking about the multifunctionality, because we are also thinking this maybe affects the results, that the people are harmonized because of these programs, maybe in the regions. Yeah.
At the back there, if you just wait a second, I'll run back with the microphone.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that talk. I'm Felix Eigenbrod, University of Southampton. I guess my question is, what's next? I mean, we know, it's great that people are reasonably happy with these landscapes, but we know that current trajectories of Western Europe are unsustainable. So how does this help us? What's next?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I was thinking about that also quite some time, because when you see the results, you say, okay, everybody's happy, like we should just keep like that. And I think we all know that this cannot be the case, because we have externalized a quite amount of our demand from other regions. But the results also show that maybe we are in a really high comfort zone where it's really hard to find ways that people will change their demand, because they are in this comfort zone right now. And so I think first our results are really interesting in this case, like showing the current situation and how to deal with that, but also to understand maybe the issues or the conflicts who will come up when we want to change this whole system. So we were not looking on the demand side at the moment, like what should be done that demand, the prioritization of ecosystem services maybe could change. So this will be, would be a next step. And the other step, what we are currently focusing on, is getting more specific information about how to measure different ecosystem services, in particular the cultural services, because now, like you have seen on one slide, all these indicators for the different ecosystem services, and that was really a challenge, like to find indicators for all the services and then the data, what is available. But especially for cultural services, I think, we really need to refine our indicators, and this is what we are currently doing in another project.
Great, thanks. We have got quite a lot of time for questions, so please be patient. I think we'll probably get through quite a lot. So, yeah, I'll come to you next.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. Following on from the previous question, have you applied this methodology to the way local authorities consider the grant of planning consent for developers, for instance, in house building or in other infrastructure development situations, where they have a duty to consult with local populations to consider objections and modifications?
Yeah, I think that is one ambition we have with this calculation, so that stakeholders in the regions can use it as a participatory tool to reflect the demand of their social system in the regions, and thinking about how different changes are changing the situation in the regions. So this is really like, should be as a tool, not as an advice. And then at the end of our project, we have shown stakeholders in the regions our results of the different simulations, and we're discussing the results with them. And that was quite interesting, because they were saying, like, for some scenarios that wouldn't be possible in reality, for example, because some parts of the regions cannot be changed because of different protection laws, or that they were interested in other goals, like, for example, in Sophie, they are next to Berlin, so tourism is really a big sector there, and they really were really interested in, like, when tourism is rising above all other stakeholder groups as a prioritized group. And so with this simulation, we could play, like, with regional stakeholders, diverse scenarios, and then see the effects and discuss that with them. So, yeah.
But if I could just add to that, you've hit on exactly the problem, because increasing tourism and conversion of rural properties into B&B and other pressures on the landscape are a counter to the valuation, not adding to the valuation.
So at the moment, they are one part. So they are one stakeholder group who also have a multifunctional or a demand for a multifunctional landscape. And in the workshop, I also asked about the influence of specific stakeholders in the social system. But surprisingly, this influence score had no effect on the results. So yeah, that was a surprise.
Well, yeah, I saw you first, Jess. So.
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm Jess Davis from Lancaster University. I had a question originally, like Felix's, actually, about the future, and that not so much the externalities, but the future in these landscapes and the risk of losing ecosystem services, because it's a really interesting finding, isn't it, that it's kind of organised to a kind of near optimum, but a major change would be detrimental. But in the future, that we need major change to protect us. So that was just a comment, I suppose. But sorry, I'm being terrible. If I got a different question, so I was interested in your equity as a factor, and does sort of increase in equity ever mean that some of the groups that are currently benefiting lose out to prioritise equity, and whether you had to have that conversation with any of your stakeholders that they might have to have less so that others can have more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to your first point, what would be also interesting is to integrate the effects of climate change or biodiversity loss, like the big risks into our simulations. But yeah, I'm a social scientist. I always have like this issue, just put some data in it and then it will work. But no, I realized in my team that this is quite difficult because of the temporal aspect. And so we have our natural science data collected since 2006, but even that is not enough to really reflect the effects of climate change or biodiversity loss in our scenarios quite well. So this is another issue. And there's one other project in the exploratories now in the new phase who is focusing on telecoupling. So they're really focusing on this aspect of how to integrate this telecoupled perspective. But for us, it was just the first try to combine the natural science data and the regional social science data together. And then to your second point, what was it again? Equity. The equity. Thanks. Yeah, that would be something really interesting, I guess, to talk especially with farmers, that they will lose some provisioning or some cropland, but will increase their multifunctionality even if they are even at the time when they are losing some of their ecosystem services supply. And so that would be really, really interesting discussion, I guess. But we couldn't have like any meeting because of COVID. So that was really a pity at the end, because I wanted to go with the results into the regions and having like real stakeholder workshops to discuss the results. But then at the end, we were only able to have a Zoom meeting, and like with stakeholders and Zoom meeting, getting a really a discussion is quite difficult. So yeah, that was the pity of Corona.
Great.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Samuel from the National Trust. And I guess just in response to that last point you made, in the UK, at a kind of macro level and a political level, that kind of conversation with farmers is playing out in a really big way right now as we create our new system for environmental land management going forwards, having left Europe, and at a sort of more micro level playing out with the National Trust and our tenants all the time, and I can tell you it's a challenging place to be at the coalface. I'm sure you know that. I actually, you talked, Sophie, a little bit about how much all of your stakeholders embrace the multifunctional nature of land and how positive that is. But you also noted that these were designated landscapes where perhaps there's a higher awareness of a range of values in the sort of local community. And you also talked about externalizing, perhaps as Europe and the UK, the extent to which we're externalizing our demand to other regions and we're in a high comfort zone. And so I guess I was wondering whether there are any plans to play this out, redo this kind of work in places that are not highly designated, that are more being relied on for intensive types of food production and things like that, and see what the results look like there, which either in Germany or further afield. And then a second question, if I may, which was you talked about the need to refine our indicators for cultural services, and I'm a heritage director, so for me the kind of cultural stuff is really important and interesting, and you mentioned another project, and I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about what's happening there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, I think like for your first point, which I maybe also have to mention is in the quantitative survey, we haven't used like a ranking of ecosystem services. So the people, they had 20 points which they distributed across the different services. So we got like another perspective that what is normally used with this or visible with this ranking score. And I think that was really like a promising step, also to get more realistic data and see where the distribution is really getting into. And then, yeah, with my new project, which I'm really, really happy that this was funded for the next phase, we are focusing on the cultural landscape specifically in the 3 regions, because I have realized as a social scientist, it's quite interesting to have like this micro perspective and have people scored like different ecosystem services, but the direct and indirect drivers within the social system, they're not really reflected at the moment in this whole debate. So in our new project, we are focusing on different megatrends, like, for example, the demographic change, the value change, mobility trends in rural areas in Germany, technology, who are all somehow influencing our perception on a cultural landscape and having an impact on it, or the cultural landscape is having an influence on how we develop these different trends. And so we are looking more into these trends. And then one part of this project is also to have a deeper look into cultural ecosystem services, because in my interviews, what I've done in the regions, people were talking about the cultural landscape, but also heritage sites, the roads, what is built by humans were integrated in this perspective. And at the moment, the ecosystem services concept is not really reflecting that. And so our goal is also to get a broader perspective of how or what shapes a cultural landscape and how to integrate that then into this ecosystem services concept or nature's contribution to people. Yeah, so that's the goal of Sokula, our new project.
Great, I'm going to take 2 more questions. So I saw you first and then I'll come to you.
Hi, Mattia Mancini from the University of Exeter. So a couple of points that I think your presentation raises really well, and I would like your comments on, are the fact that it seems to me that basically in that particular study area, people are happy with the status quo. And we talked about top-down versus bottom-up approaches. And I think it's fair to assume that if we were thinking about a bottom-up approach to promote change, that would not happen. And therefore, there would be some form of top-down approach required in order to promote change that would benefit everyone. If that's the case, land is privately owned. How would you go about obtaining this higher, what we know from the science, that is a sort of a higher level in terms of provisioning of existing services and equity landscape?
Yeah, thank you for this point. I think that's the main problem, the implementation and then really getting it on the ground. I think our tool maybe is the possibility to have like the bottom-up perspective, like to really reflect what the people prioritize in the regions, and then having them present maybe on a round table, so that different stakeholder groups are looked at, and not only like farmers or forestry who have a direct impact of landscape, but also other stakeholder groups who have a demand. And so from this point of view, I think it's quite a democratic tool from the bottom up to integrate all perspectives. On the other side, politicians or other stakeholders who wants to shape the landscape can use it as a tool of information to see when they change or when they have a specific goal, what's the impact on the social ecological system, and then thinking about how to proceed or how maybe to make it better. And on the other side, I think what is also quite interesting with our tool is that, now I lost my point. What? So politicians can use it as a tool, reflect the priorities, and then on the other side, you can play through these different scenarios together and sit together and then see the impacts of your different goals before you are maybe implementing them. So, yeah.
Can I ask a follow-on question from that, Sophie? Take chair's privilege and ask you a question myself. Is there what policy instruments are used in Germany? If politicians want to increase biodiversity or increase carbon capture in the landscape, whatever, could you talk us through what sort of agri-environment schemes or incentives there might be for that are used in Germany? Because a lot of our work in multifunctional landscapes in the UK is sort of set in that context of, okay, we want to try and implement some change by changing the behaviours of private landowners, and there's going to be some sort of incentivization of that. And what does it look like in Germany?
Super complex, super bureaucratic. So it's really like a mining field, I think. Like there are different schemes for each land use, as it is for all, and then we have like the European programs, and then reflected on the regional level in regional programs. So for each land use, there are different programs. So for agriculture, we have similar something like the CAP. For forestry, and then the ownership comes in, like for state-owned forests, there are another programs than for like private-owned forest, and you have different political instruments like incentives, like subsidies, or like more soft instruments like information, but also if you like some punishment tools if you don't do a specific treatment. So it's really complex, I guess, and another project is really looking at specific sectors and look at the trade-offs and conflicts also between these programs, because they have specific goals, and then maybe there's a trade-off with another goal for another program. So this is really the reality then, and also that we cannot like just move as we want, because we have all these strict laws and regulations established.
Great, thanks. One more question.
Thanks, John Storkey at Rothamsted Research. Are you considering the potential to improve multifunctionality within a land use type? So, for example, you can reconcile the trade-off between biodiversity and productivity in grasslands by using, we call them herbal lays, or multi-species grasslands. which contribute to biodiversity and possibly carbon storage while maintaining livestock production?
Yeah, for sure. You could have a focus only on one bit of our land use types. So this was done, for example, by my colleague Gaëtan Leprevaux, who is in one paper focusing only on grassland management, and then how the multifunctionality changes for all stakeholder groups when you are implementing different grassland management strategies. So I would refer then to this paper, because yeah, grassland is our specific land use type where we are mostly focusing on in our group. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much, Sophie. So I think we've given Sophie enough of a grilling now, and so I'd just like to thank you again for your presentation and for visiting the conference, and good luck with your research. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.